On Dodson,
Margie Bartles too.
And we're here to talk to you about a cash appraisal contingency addendum. And Margie, there's several parts to this. So if a purchaser is going to lay down an enormous amount of cash, we need to understand, is it contingent upon appraisal or is it not? So let's talk a little bit about this. The Part A says that the appraisal is equal to or greater in value than the sales price. And then there's an or.
And that B is the appraisal is not equal to or greater than the sales price and the purchaser elects not to proceed. So that would involve a release. And then we have C.
C. The purchaser elects to proceed with the consumption of this contract without regard to the appraisal. And that means everybody's going to get some money or give some money.
Indeed. What I would say to you about an appraisal on a cash transaction, and I want you to think a little bit about your escalation addendum. Your escalation addendum always talks about, is it contingent on appraisal? And so that, I'm seeing a lot of cash transactions actually have an escalation too. And so the escalation and this document should say the same thing.
Right.
If the escalation says no appraisal necessary, this document should say
no appraisal.
No appraisal.
Right.
So keep in mind that's a consumer decision. And there are still consumers out there, even in a market that's tightening up, there are still consumers out there that are like, I have my money, I want to go to closing. So just be aware.
Yep, that's a good one. Thank you, Margie. So we have 4 different options on financing, and we have conventional financing and appraisal contingency, and it's pretty specific about who's supposed to be doing what. And we have time frames set up, and this contract is contingent until 9 p.m., and you have to select the number of days from the date of ratification. So we're seeing the appraisers are taking just a smidge longer than they used to be, 21 days. So I think, we need to be cognizant of how many days we're giving. If we're saying we want to close in 30 days, but we're not going to get the appraisal in that 21-day time frame, what do you think we need to do?
The reality of the number of days for appraisal and or closing is that if you are using a time is of the essence contract, it's extremely important that you keep all of those dates exactly as they read. If you are not using time is of the essence, then the reality is, as the board attorney says, you have a bit of a cushion. What Mr. Pill says is, probably not a month, but you might have a couple weeks. What your broker's going to say is extend it in writing.
Right.
And you should do that for your consumer. But what I would suggest is that you make certain that you allow enough days that you're not playing catch up, or that you get caught in the fact that maybe a consumer buyer has already had remorse. And I will tell you that is in the water out there.
Yes, it is. And so I know you yourself, and so am I, a big advocate of writing that extension as necessary, because it gives you as the licensee the opportunity to follow up and make sure that 1, the appraisal's been ordered, 2, that someone's been contacted to actually show up and do it, and that you have given that extra window in writing. It protects everybody.
It does. I think the other thing that I think the appraisal and these dates apply to is, keep in mind in the residential sales contract, it talks about, can the buy side and the list side agent contact the lender? And realistically, there are lots of agents out there that are saying the buy side can't contact the lender. So if you're approaching the number of days and it's expiring, or it is absolutely coming at your threshold, it's extremely important for the client that you represent that you know what the status of the appraisal and the financing is.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other one that Margie and I have talked about before is the FHA financing contingency. And in this contingency, there is actually a funding fee, a potential for a funding fee. And so as part of this financing, the buyer's agent should be aware by having a conversation with the lender in advance of writing a contract, especially if it's going to be an FHA financing, we know whether there is or is not a funding fee, and in this extreme event, whether the seller is going to pay the funding fee or the buyer has to pay the funding fee. So let's just kind of talk about that a little bit.
I think it's really important that the agent is never going to be the finance person for the contract,
Right.
but there needs to be good, intelligent conversation with the lender over where are we on the money, and do we indeed have all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed. And in an FHA situation with maybe the 3% down, historically I'm saying that the funding fee is getting financed. But if the seller has to pay it, we need to present it that way.
Right.
So that means that the buy-side agent needs to actually write it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, we just have to make sure that if there's any seller subsidy attached to that, that's properly documented in the sales agreement as well.
Indeed. Another thing that I brought up to Dawn that now is becoming increasingly important, I've already gotten some calls from outside agents, and that is all of these financing addenda changed about 1.5 years ago. They do not have an interest rate threshold amount.
Right.
So pretty much the way they read is prevailing interest rate.
Right.
We are in a rising rate environment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the agent needs to be very careful with the lender so that the consumer understands in a very candid, informed way he's locked in or not locked in, and this is what the rate is.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is, I don't know there's much protection for the consumer if they can afford a higher rate
Mm-hmm.
that they haven't said, well, this is my threshold.
Right.
And it'd have to be handwritten in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, we have the USDA contingency, which also always has an appraisal. And I very often find that contracts are written with an FHA, a USDA, and a VA financing contingency. And there's many times where the condition of the property has put a issue out, like maybe the roof is condemned by VA appraisal. And so we always have to know that when you're expecting to get a ratified contract, I feel like you as the licensee have a duty to pay attention to the condition of the property, because if you know you're writing an offer with one of these government-backed loans, you should be aware of this is probably going to be an issue. It may come up in home inspection, it may come up in the appraisal, but we need to be aware of those things so that we can address them at the proper time.
Absolutely. Some of the things that come up in an appraisal for a government loan is the basement wet?
Right.
Does the roof have more than 5 years remaining? Is there heat in every room? Is there a handrail at every ingress and egress?
Right.
There are things that come up, and unfortunately in the USDA, FHA, VA arena, the property is going to be just as important, its condition, as the buyer's credit is.
Right.
And so please understand, if you call a listing agent and a listing agent says to you, I don't think this property is going to go VA, or I don't think this property is going to go USDA. What the listing agent is trying to do is to save you some time and not break your buyer's heart.
Right.
To get real deep into a financing transaction and then find out that the property just cannot go that particular program.
And many times, the cost of a roof can be vast.
Absolutely.
So sellers may not have that window of opportunity to spend that money. And so now there's this big mushroom cloud that's happening with your transaction.
Lots of sellers are willing to take less money just so they don't have to do work.
Right.
They're not of a mind to get the highest price that's necessary.
Yeah. So we need to be good negotiators too.
We do.
How about that?
Hey, I think that's a good place to end, don't you, Dawn?
Yes, I do, Margie.
All
Thanks
right.
so much, and don't forget, ask your broker.